All right, so starting from the top, if you're not familiar with slip casting from a mold, essentially what I have here is a mold. So this is made out of plaster. There's a lot of different types of plaster. So I wanted to teach mold making tonight because you can actually go to the hardware store and buy plaster of Paris over the counter. It's not going to be the same quality as the plaster that we use in pottery generally, which is called pottery plaster #1. But it's going to work. It's just a little bit less absorbent, but you'll still be able to have a usable mold from just the hardware store. Plaster of Paris, it looks like this, comes in a bucket. So, you know, this is stuff that you guys can do at home while we don't have access to the studio. So essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to pour liquid slip. So at the studio, we sell this liquid slip from Laguna called Toshi Porcelain. There's many different kinds of slip. It's basically just liquefied clay that has a material called deflocculant in it that reverses the magnetic pull of the particles and has them push away from each other rather than flock together. So it increases the flow of the material. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fill the void of this plaster mold with slip. And so the plaster material is thirsty and it absorbs the water from the slip. And so as you let the slip sit inside the mold, a thin shell forms around all of the surfaces of the mold. And so we wait a certain amount of time until the thickness gets to a thickness that we want. And so we're not going to go into detail about time or thickness of slip. That'll be later. But essentially, once that thin shell forms, then we're going to dump out all of the excess slip. And then we're going to allow that thin shell to set up until we can release it from the mold. So this is actually a finished piece that came out of that mold. And so this has been high fired. You can see, obviously, how much it shrank, but it would look very similar to this after it had set up for usually around 20 minutes. 30 minutes is enough time for the shell to form, and then we can remove it out of the mold. And so molds allow you to reproduce an object over and over again, and it'll be the exact object. So, you know, for production purposes, it's really effective for that. But it also allows you to do a lot of things that you can't on a pottery wheel or by hand. It's really great for doing very angular, straight-lined objects that are really difficult to produce by hand. So, you know, it really extends our ability as ceramic artists to make shapes that are very difficult to make by hand. So let me switch to a slideshow real quick. Okay, so this is just a piece that has come out of a mold, as you can see. So the mold that I showed you of mine is a simple one-piece mold. Molds can can be multiple parts. I've seen, you know, 30-part molds before. They become very difficult to make when the mold parts increase in number, but you can produce some really nice objects with just a one-piece mold. So that's a two-piece mold, obviously, because it's parting in the center. The reason it needs to be a two-piece mold is because well, let's watch just a quick video first of just a mold being filled with slip, so you can see the process just before I get a little further. They're draining the mold.
You can't see it.
You can't.
Nothing's on here.
Not playing,
Not playing.
not showing anyone.
Okay, well, that didn't work, so that's fine. Not sure why. You can see the PowerPoint presentation right there.
Yes.
Interesting. So you can't see the video.
No.
Oh. All right. Well, that's okay. So, you know, I kind of explained already the process of filling with liquid slip, allowing the thin shell to form, and then releasing it from the mold. So we'll just skip the video, no worries. So essentially, the first thing that we really need to be concerned with when we're making a mold is the concept of an undercut. So we need to avoid an undercut so that the piece that's sitting inside of the mold will be able to release once it's dry. So these images help conceptualize the idea of an undercut a little bit better. So focus your attention to the far right of the object with the X's. So you see the red lines that are cross-hatched there. And so that is an undercut. So basically the white border, the outside is the plaster. And then the interior is the piece that's being formed. So once the thin shell forms and the piece is done, you're going to try and pull the part out of the mold, and it's going to become stuck inside of the mold because of these undercuts. And then there's below that, there's a little, what would be a perfectly good object, except for that one little nodule that's poking out to the left there. And so that is an undercut, and that's going to prevent the piece from releasing from the mold. And then if you go to the far left there, the first object would be a fine object to come out of the mold in a one-piece design. And then if somebody could please mute there. I'm hearing background noise. So the second object is a piece that wouldn't be able to release from the mold because it has that big belly. And so when you tried to pull it out, it would be stuck. So we could go back to the first image. So this piece, if it wasn't coming apart in the center there, that piece wouldn't be able to come out of that thin hole at the top, right? So that's an undercut. You know, this takes, you know, a little while to wrap your head around. So, you know, don't be discouraged if you're not understanding the concept of an undercut right away. You know, as you explore molds, you'll really start to be able to visualize and understand it a little bit more. So here's just some simple materials that we're going to need to make our simple one-part mold tonight. So I'm showing you the simple plaster of Paris that you can buy at Home Depot. Oops. Just any kind of bucket works. I use the HDX buckets because they have the measurements on the side. Murphy soap oil is really useful if your model. So I'm going to be referring to the object that I'm making as a model. So when you're making a mold of something, of an object, we call it a model instead of a piece or whatever. So if I'm going to make my model out of something other than clay, I need to coat that surface in some sort of release agent. So the Murphy soap oil works really well for that. So you can make molds from any type of material, basically, you know, wood, metal, plastic, but all the surfaces are going to need to be coated with some kind of release. We're not going to be doing that. So hey, Steph, can you mute everyone? So we don't need to worry about the Murphy soap oil tonight. But we're going to need, we're going to be using flashing, which is on the bottom left. So that's a roofing material that you can easily find at Home Depot. And so that's basically what we're going to be filling with the plaster and surrounding our model with to create our mold. And then I'm using clay to make my model. That's usually how I make all of my models. It works really well because you don't need to use any sort of release agent like the Murphy's soap oil to release the model when your mold is done. You just crumble up that model because it's soft plastic clay and rip it out. And I tend to make molds out of thrown objects. And so this is just a really quick way to generate models quickly. I throw the object and then right off of the bat, I surround it in my flashing and then I make my mold like that. So it's a really quick way to make a mold. And then another optional material is the isopropyl alcohol. I spray that over the top of the plaster surface once it's poured, and that breaks the surface tension and kills any air bubbles that you would find in your plaster mold. So I'm going to show you guys the quick and dirty way to mix your plaster tonight. It allows you to mix plaster by eye instead of using specific gravity, which is what you should be using to mix your plaster if you want really high quality molds. And if you're planning on getting into this, you know, you need to nerd out as much as possible with your materials. And so this is the real way that we're going to mix plaster. So basically it's just a 3-part to 2-part by weight ratio. But tonight I'm going to show you kind of the old school method we called the island method that we just do by eye. So I suggest if you are interested in molds that you purchase this book by Andrew Martin. This is a phenomenal book. It will teach you absolutely everything you need to know about mold making. Andrew is like one of the best mold makers to date. Interestingly enough, you know, mold making has been really disregarded by the ceramics community for a really long time because it's synonymous with production ceramics, commercial ceramics. And so in the fine art world for a really long time, the use of molds, you know, was considered cheating or only suitable for commercial ceramics. But in the last 20 years, that mode of thinking is broken down, and artists like Andrew Martin have shown how molds can extend your ability to make different types of objects and really interesting, complex objects. So he's definitely one of the better mold makers out there. And this book is cheap. It's on Amazon. It's like $15 or $20. So definitely buy it. So I just wanted to show a couple artists that use molds as their primary process in work. And I wanted to show Andrew's work because he is the one that first developed this marbled slip technique that if you go onto Instagram, you know, so many people have appropriated this process of marbled slip and have become very well known for it and sell a ton of work because of it. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I think that Andrew doesn't get his due credit a lot of the times. I don't think he would really care too much, but you know, I think it's good to mention that, you know, he's the guy that did it first. So again, Andrew's work's amazing. Then you have Wendy Walgate. I really love her work because she actually sources old commercial molds that were used, you know, by crafty folk. A lot of these are like mid-century molds that were commercially produced. And so she casts these forms and then sticks them together to form these assemblages that are really, really interesting. So one of the amazing things about slip casting is your ability to attach pieces together. So you can attach two dried slip cast objects with just a little bit of liquid slip. So there's no slipping and scoring. There's no intercepting the material at this viable state that we call leather hard. So we know in the studio with the clay that we use, if you want to attach a handle, the handle has to be leather hard. The body of the piece has to be leather hard. You have to slip and score, you have to add slip, and then you have to dry slowly. With slip cast objects, you wait till they're bone dry. You just take a little bit of liquid slip and then you just stick it right to another piece. And so, again, this really extends our ability to do some pretty amazing things that we don't normally get to do with plastic clay. And then the last one is Richard Notkin. So you can see how incredibly complex a molded piece can be. So these aren't coming from a single mold. These are coming from lots of different molds. And then he's sticking the pieces together. And so he makes these Yixing teapots. And so the Yixing teapot tradition, I believe, started in China. And it's a miniature teapot that is made for personal use. It's supposed to be a very intimate object. And so Richard Notkin has primarily focused his practice on Yixing teapot culture. So he's definitely one of the more skilled fine art mold makers out there to date. So that concludes the slide presentation. So now I'm going to jump into making our one-part mold. So this is the object that I'm going to be making a mold from today. It's just a very small tumbler. As we can see, it doesn't have any undercuts, so it's going to release from our mold when it's ready very easily. This is a solid thrown form. I've left it stuck to the bat, which is very important when I pour the plaster over the top, that it stays in this position and doesn't move around. And it's also really great because, you know, you can make some really cool objects that maybe you wouldn't be able to throw, but you know, throw with a thin wall. But if you can make it solid, then you can make a mold out of it. So, you know, this might be really helpful to some people. Another really cool thing you can do is, you know, just center a really rough block of clay, let it get to leather hard, and then trim it with your trim tools while it's on the wheel. And you can get a really nice smooth surface with sharp corners and render a really nice form. So I've found that this is my favorite way to make a mold, is just right from a thrown object that's stuck to a bat. Okay, so let me try and switch back to the camera mode. If it doesn't work, we will stop, but I just wanted to try. Let's see. Okay. So the first thing we're going to be doing is using our flashing. So I have my flashing right here. So I've already taped it off. I've taped it really, really well, as you can see, from the inside and from the outside. So when I fill this with plaster, my seam doesn't burst open and allow plaster to go everywhere. This is just reminding me, actually, I'm not sure what happened to the last slide on my slide presentation, but there's 4 rules that I need to make you aware of before we start this. So we don't put plaster down the sink. That will ruin our drain. So when you're doing this at home, make sure the plaster does not go down your sink. Make sure the plaster doesn't end up in any clay that you intend to fire in a kiln. It will blow up. So that goes without saying, no plaster whatsoever in a kiln, it will blow up. And then we don't allow any plaster in our studio just because of all the reasons that I just told you. We are going to offer mold making classes in the future. We'll hold those classes outside just so we don't get any cross contamination. Seriously, a little tiny speck of plaster that ends up in clay will have a very significant blowout in the kiln. So we just have to make really sure that we don't have any plaster in the studio. Okay, so I've taken my my flashing and I've surrounded, we're getting a little lag. So I've surrounded my model with my flashing. So that's where my plaster is going to go into, is that negative space around my model. So I've left about 1 inch all the way around, which is about the perfect amount of space. If we leave a ton of space and the cross section ends up being really, really thick, that just means that this mold is going to take weeks and weeks and weeks to dry. So it's best to try and get, your walls as thin as possible. Maybe not as thin as possible, but somewhere around 1 inch thick is great. So now I'm going to be taking plastic clay and I'm going to be creating a seal all the way around the bottom part of my flashing. So I'm going to hold it in place and then I'm just going to work that plastic clay around the edge of my flashing. So I'm creating a seal all the way around. And it's very, very, very critical that I spend the necessary time to ensure that I've made a really nice seal. Because if I haven't, I'm going to pour plaster into this flashing and it's going to leak out all over the floor and we're going to have a plaster disaster, which is absolutely terrible. It's happened to me quite a few times. It'll happen to you. But if you can avoid it, definitely try your best to, because cleaning it up is a huge pain. So I'm just going to get this initial bead of material down, and then I'm really going to go around and really smooth it out and make sure my seal is really good. So I'm using quite a bit of material here, just to ensure that it stays. So I should mention that the model that I made out of clay is porcelain clay. And the reason I use porcelain is because it doesn't have any grog in it. And so the surface is perfectly smooth. And so that's going to render a really nice slip cast piece at the end. So if I was to use an object like this, which is made out of granite, you can see the surface has these pitted quality to it. And so the piece that you get out of the mold is going to have those that texture to it. So you want to use a really nice smooth model, whether that's out of plastic or wood or ceramic or plastic clay. So I'm just going to build up my wall just a little bit higher just to make sure that it's going to hold. Again, if there's one part of this process not to rush, it's this part. How's the video? Are we okay?
There's a delay, but it's okay.
Tolerable? All right.
Good, good.
Cool. All right. So another thing you want to make really sure of is that you're working on a really flat surface. You know, if it's not a flat surface, that could also allow the plaster to leak out. So I like working off these bats, these plastic bats, because I know they're nice and flat. All right, so we will call that good. So now we need to mix our plaster. So I have my bucket that I'm going to mix my plaster in here. So I have it about a quarter of the way filled. So we're always going to, when we're mixing plaster, we're always going to be adding the dry material to water. And so if you buy that Andrew Martin book, he gives you various formulas for estimating volume and how much plaster you'll need for that volume. I'm just going to eyeball it. I've done this a lot, so I can eyeball pretty well. I'm definitely going to have more plaster than I need. You always want to give yourself a little bit extra so you're not short. And so also you want to choose a bucket that allows you to mix enough plaster. You don't want your water level to be any higher than a quarter of the way filled, because once you add your plaster, you're going to be so close to the top that it's going to overflow on you. So this is like, yeah, about a quarter of the way filled. You know, again, we're using a 3-part to 2-part plaster to water ratio. So I'm going to need quite a bit of plaster, and it's going to be, you know, a little over half filled. So unfortunately, look, it looks like it's going to be difficult to kind of see. Well, it looks a little better now, actually. Since it's all white, it's having a little trouble focusing. So I have my plaster material here. So when we're adding the plaster to the water, we want to be concerned about breaking up lumps as much as possible. So I'm going to be taking my plaster, pouring it over my hands, and breaking up the plaster with my hands as it goes into the water. And so the old school way of mixing plaster that I mentioned that allows you to do it by eye is what's called the island method. And so I'm going to be pouring this dry plaster into my water, and I'm going to be aiming for it to hit the middle of the bucket the whole entire time. And I'm going to be slowly adding that plaster until it breaks through the surface of the water and it creates a little island that stays dry. So once that island establishes itself and is able to stand without absorbing water and then going back under the surface, we know that we've added enough plaster to the water. So I'm just going to go ahead and start. So you want to add this really slowly. You don't want to rush this part of the process either. If we go too fast, you're going to end up compacting the plaster, and it's not going to mix well. You're going to end up with hard chunks inside of it. So you can see I'm just going really slow. Definitely a good idea to wear a mask. So you want your water to be a room temperature. If you use too cold of water, that's going to increase this expansion rate of the plaster, and you're going to have issues with your flashing or whatever material you're using to house the plaster. So, you know, right around 70. Well, looks like we lost it. All right, I'm going to switch out of this view. All right, so we'll figure it out next time. It's worth a try. Okay, so just continuing on. So a lot of people think that as soon as you start adding the dry plaster to the bucket, that's starting the setting process of the plaster, and you really need to rush to get through so the plaster doesn't set up on you. So that's actually not true. You can add plaster to the water and let the plaster soak for up to 30 minutes before it actually starts to set up. So you actually really want to allow the plaster to soak for at least a few minutes before you start mixing it, just so you ensure all the plaster has absorbed water. And then the most important part is once you've added all of your plaster, you have your island formed, you've let it soak for just a little bit. The most important part is that you mix it incredibly thoroughly. So I set a timer for 5 minutes. You want to do a 5-minute mix of the plaster once you've got your island formed and it's soaked. So that's another part of the process that you absolutely cannot rush, or else you're going to get a really weak plaster that will take forever to set up. So I'm starting to get my island formed to try and give you a view here. I don't know if we can see this, probably not. No, I don't think we're going to be able to.
You can see it.
Well, now something's happening. You can see it? You could.
We could see it when you tipped it.
Something else is like screwing up right now. Hold on. Love technical difficulties. Okay, so you can't see that.
Yeah, you can.
So you can see the island.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that island is still absorbing water. It needs to be a little more substantial. So I'm going to add a little bit more plaster. Not too much more, but just a little bit. How's that for estimation? That's all the plaster we have left. Pretty decent. Okay, so that's looking like a nice, substantial island there. Still absorbing water, crumbling, but that's going to stay an island. So we're going to stop there. We're going to let this just absorb for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds. This was me working normally. I would probably give it a little bit more time. But we'll make up for it in the mixing process. So now I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And we're going to start our mixing process. Always set a timer. Don't ever estimate. It's 5 minutes is so much longer than you think it is when you're mixing. So I'm starting. So if I'm mixing a large amount of plaster, I'll use a paddle and a drill. So a propeller paddle like this on a drill, and that will make mixing really nice and easy. For a small amount of plaster, I'm just going to use this little wooden stick here. So I can field a couple questions right now if anybody has any.
So what, I couldn't remember, what kind of dryness did you have for the piece that you're making the mold from? How wet is it when you're going to pour the plaster on it?
Great question. So since this model, the piece that I threw, is solid, it can be fresh, it can be wet. I just threw this right before we started class. So the fact that it's solid means that it's going to have enough integrity to resist the pressure of the plaster that's going to be poured around it. If you're using a model that has a thin wall, that needs to be dry. So it needs to be pretty much bone dry or a hard leather hard before you pour plaster around it, because otherwise it's going to just crumble under the pressure of the plaster.
Eric, you were talking about Wendy Walgate and how those things can just stick together. How did she get the different colors?
Yeah, I mean, she could have used a tinted porcelain. So another one of the really cool things that you're able to do with slip casting is I can take mason stain and add it to my liquid slip so that I get the clay turns a color. So that's what I did on this piece. So these inlays are made with slip that has been tinted with mason stain.
I see.
Yeah. So that could be the way she did it, but she also could have just as easily painted on the glaze. Anyone else? So it's really good to use a designated bucket for mixing plaster, just so you never run the risk of cross-contaminating. You know, if I'm going to do a lot of plaster projects, I like to line my bucket in a plastic bag. And so when I'm done mixing the plaster, I can just pick up the bag and toss it rather than have to clean my bucket each time. So that works out really well.
All right, so you said we're going to have a mess of making plaster at some point, and cleaning it up is crazy. How do you clean up plaster that you spilled?
So be prepared. Have a big bucket of water near your workspace, a 5-gallon bucket, and some sponges at the ready. So, you know, it's honestly not that big of a deal as long as you get to it super quickly. So you have that bucket of water, you have your sponges, you just sop it up as quickly as possible while it's wet. You know, if it hits the ground, you know, the clock starts ticking, it's setting up. So if you don't have water ready, you don't have sponges ready, you know, that material is going to stick to your floor and become hard. And then it's going to be a massive pain to get up and you might not ever get it off of your floor. So definitely just like be prepared with a bucket and some sponges. But if you're dealing with material when it's still wet, you know, it's not even going to ruin your sponge. You'll be able to wash the sponge out. And then you just let that plaster settle in the bottom of the bucket that you used to clean up. And then eventually it's going to harden in the bottom of the bucket. You pour off the water and then you just bust out that chunk that settles in the bottom of your bucket.
That's good advice.
Yeah, good question. Plaster disaster is not fun.
Get out of there.
What's that? All right, we got 9 seconds here. All right, so this is probably going to be a little difficult to show. So unfortunately not going to be able to really see inside, but we kind of know what it looks like in there. So not too much of any special technique on this. We're basically just trying to do a nice controlled pour. You're trying to keep it in one spot. So I'm just going to focus that just right over the top of my model. And so we want to submerge the entire piece by about 1 inch. So I'm getting close to the surface. Now I'm covering it. So I'm just going to go a little bit higher. So that's about 1 inch over the top. So once I have my plaster poured in, I'm going to want to tamp the sides. So that's going to bring up any air bubbles. So you can see those little air bubbles coming to the surface right now. So by tamping it, brings those air bubbles to the top. And then we take our handy dandy isopropyl alcohol that we have in a little spray container. And then we just hit the surface and that breaks up all those bubbles. So you just need one little tiny spray and that'll kill all the bubbles. I'll do another tamp to make sure. So that looks good. So plaster is thixotropic, meaning if you continue to move it around, it will continue to stay liquid. That's true for a certain amount of time. So if I keep shaking it around, moving it, it's going to stay liquid a lot longer than if I just step away and let it set. If I just stop the movement, it's going to set up quicker. It's also exothermic. So as the water leaves the plaster, it's going to heat up a lot. So this is going to become quite warm as it's sitting here and setting up. So don't be alarmed when your mold hits like 100 degrees. But essentially, you know, it's going to take, it doesn't really take that long for plaster to set up. So, you know, this thing will be hard enough and set up enough to where I could remove it from the flashing in about 20 minutes. It's always best to let it set longer. You know, patience is a virtue. The material really just appreciates being left alone. So I will leave this for longer, but it will be set enough to release. So I usually, you know, give myself a little bit of extra plaster. So I have about an inch thick extra plaster here at the bottom of my bucket. So I let that set in the bottom of my bucket, and then I have a nice little plaster bat at the end of this that I just pop out of the bucket, and then you can use that to dry clay out. So don't throw away your excess plaster. It's really nice to have around. You can also use it, like, I just have these little blanks here from plaster molds that I've cast. That's the bottom of the bucket. You can actually make sprig molds out of this too, so I could carve into it and then make a little press mold. You know, to save the material, you can always do something with it. So that is it.
So question for you. Is there any issues with just leaving the mold for a day or 2 days? The length of time you leave it doesn't make a difference.
Nope, not at all. You know, that's the best way to do it, is just pour all your molds and then go home and check them the next day. But you know, if you're super excitable and have to see it, wait at least 20 or 30 minutes for the plaster to be set up.
Eric, when you tamped it, you sprayed it with something. Was that the alcohol?
Yeah, that's the isopropyl. So that breaks the surface tension and kills those bubbles. More questions?
So how do you make the molds that are cut in half, like the one that you showed at the beginning, where you cut it in half and do that?
So much more complex and much more difficult.
It would seem like
you know,
that.
there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. You know, it's going to be difficult for me to explain just verbally how that happens.
Okay.
You know, yeah, it's
Because you have to put the stoppers or some kind of holes in to slot them to keep them the sides straight or something like that. The two halves.
No, not necessarily. Yeah, it's tough. Like, you know, I could take this object and divide it by its hemisphere here, or just, you know, laterally, if you will. And then I would pull those apart So if you can visualize, I have one half in my hand. So I would take that half and put it on a flat surface. And then I would surround that, pour plaster over the top. So I have half of a mold. And then I would need to release that mold, flip it over, create another barrier, put the other half of my mold back on. And
Okay,
then
got it. Right. Okay.
That's like the simple way to do it, but it can get more complex.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, you know, like the more you do this, the easier it is for you to just like visualize all this stuff. Like I'll just sit there and stare off into space on my couch and just like visualize how things can be pieced together or pulled apart. Once you understand the concept of an undercut and you've made a 1-part mold and a 2-part mold, like you'll just start to be able to visualize it. That's like, I don't know, it's just practice, you know?
Mhm.
Eric, the contamination issue with plaster of Paris?
Yeah.
Is it just in the powder state or all states if it were to be mixed with clay?
All states. Yeah.
So when you're using the leftover plaster for a drying agent for clay, you'd have to be concerned with white specks, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, you know, if I'm going to use that as a drying surface, like I would make sure that these shattered edges were sanded off so that they're not ending up in the clay, because that could become an issue. Yeah.
In the studio, when we're wedging, isn't that what we're wedging on, a big tray of plaster of Paris?
It's plaster, but it's mixed with a material called hydrocal. So the hydrocal actually makes it much harder and much less likely to chip off.